The dress fit as though it had been sewn for her bones. Ivory silk, 100 tiny buttons, light pooling at the hem like spilled milk. She turned for the mirror and forgot for one breath who she was. Then the door opened behind her. He stood in the frame, gray-faced, staring as if the dead had risen. 6 weeks earlier, the housekeeper had given Marin one instruction on her first morning at the Ashcombe estate. Whatever room you clean, leave it the way you found it. The man upstairs notices what's moved. Grief makes a person count things. Marin had nodded, wiping her chapped hands on her apron. She believed then that being unseen was the safest way to live. She did not yet understand that the things we hide from out of fear are often the very things that could save us. Marin Holloway came to the house on the hill the way most things came to her, out of necessity and lateness. She was 26, widowed 2 years, and behind on the small debts that follow a poor woman like loose threads. Her husband had been a kind man with weak lungs, and after the fever took him, the rented rooms above the tailor's shop became impossible. She sold his tools, his coat, the brass clock his mother had left him. She kept only his wedding ring on a string around her neck, where no one could see it. The Ashcombe estate above the town like a held breath. Edmund Ashcombe had made his fortune in railway timber and lost his wife, Adeline, to a carriage accident on an icy bridge the winter before. The town spoke of him in the hushed, half-pitying tone reserved for rich men who had everything and nothing. He did not come down to church. He did not host. The great rooms of his house were kept lit and dusted for no one. Marin's days began before dawn. She blacked the stoves, beat the rugs, polished banisters no hand ever touched. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penhallow, ran the staff with brisk fairness and a soft spot she tried to hide. There was a boy, too, Sebastian, 8 years old, Edmund's son, who drifted through the corridors like a small ghost looking for the larger one he'd been lost. He rarely spoke. He carried a wooden horse with a chipped ear everywhere he went. Marin noticed the boy the way she noticed weather, without meaning to, then completely. She left him a folded paper bird on the nursery windowsill one afternoon, asking nothing. The next day it was gone, and a second one appeared, clumsily made, on the kitchen step where she'd find it. She had a secret she told no one. As a girl, threadbare and dreaming, Marin had pressed her face to the window of a bridal shop in the city and decided that someday she would wear a dress like the ones inside. Not to be married necessarily, but to feel just once like something rare. Life had not obliged. She had married in a borrowed gray frock, so when her cleaning brought her that 6th week to the locked east wing, and when Mrs. Penhallow handed her the key and said the late mistress's wardrobe needed airing before the moths claimed it, Marin felt the old longing stir like an ember under ash. The wardrobe room smelled of cedar and lavender and grief. Gowns hung in rows, sheathed in muslin, each one a season of a life that had ended. Marin moved down the line, airing them as instructed, her hands respectful, her heart oddly loud. And then she found it. At the far end, in its own muslin shroud, hung a wedding dress. Ivory silk, 100 tiny buttons, a hem that caught the light. She drew back the cover and simply looked. It was the dress from the city window, the dress from the girl she had been. Not the same one, of course, but the same dream made real, hanging an arm's length away in a house where no living woman would ever wear it again. Mrs. Penhallow's footsteps had faded an hour ago. The wing was empty, the house was silent, and the longing so long buried opened its eyes. She should not. She knew she should not. Marin stood with the muslin in her fist and listed her reasons like a rosary. It belonged to a dead woman. It belonged to a grieving man. She was a servant, hired to preserve, not to indulge. If she were caught, she would lose the position, and the position was the only thing standing between her and the street. There were a dozen reasons, and every one was correct. She let the cover fall back over the gown and turned to leave. At the door she stopped. It was the silence that undid her finally. The whole house was silence. The silence of rooms kept perfect for the absent, of a boy who would not speak, of a man upstairs, counting the things that had not changed because nothing in his life would ever change again. Marin had lived inside that silence for 6 weeks. She had lived inside a smaller version of it for 2 years, ever since the fever. She knew its shape the way she knew her own hands, and she thought, who would it harm? No one would see. She would put it back exactly. She would smooth every fold, fasten every button she loosened, hang it in its shroud as though she had never breathed near it. 5 minutes. One look in the glass. One moment of being, just once. The rare thing she'd pressed her face to a window for 20 years ago, with frost biting her cheeks and her boots full of snow. It was such a small theft. Not even a theft, a borrowing of air. She argued the other way again. She thought of Mrs. Penhallow's kindness, of the trust placed in her, of the paper birds and the boy. She thought that a person who does small wrong things in secret becomes, over time, a person who is mostly secret. Her husband used to say that character was simply what you did when the room was empty. The room was very empty now. But longing is not reasonable, and it does not wait for permission. It had waited 20 years already. Marin's hands moved before her conscience finished speaking. She unfastened her apron. She unpinned her hair. She told herself she would only hold the dress against her shoulders. Only that. And even, as she told herself, she was stepping out of her gray work frock, and the cool silk was sliding over her arms like water. Like a held breath finally let go, and the 100 small buttons were waiting, and she began, with trembling fingers, to fasten them one by one. The dress fit. That was the thing that stole her breath. Not the beauty of it, but the impossible exactness, as though the silk had been waiting for precisely her measurements, her height, the particular slope of her shoulders. She crossed to the tall mirror in the corner, the one draped in a sheet, and pulled the sheet away. The woman who looked back was not a maid. She was not a widow behind on her debts. She was someone Marin had never been allowed to meet. Luminous, upright, rare. She lifted her chin. She turned once slowly, and the hem swept the floor like spilled light. For one breath, one single breath, the silence in the house was not grief. It was wonder. Then the door opened behind her. It was not Edmund who opened it first. It was Sebastian. The boy stood in the doorway with his wooden horse, and his eyes went wide. Not with alarm, but with something closer to hope, terrible and immediate. "Mama," he whispered. The word landed in Marin's chest like a dropped stone. She turned, mortified, her hand flying to her throat. "No, sweetheart, no, I'm so sorry, I'm only—" But the boy had already taken a step toward her. His small face open in a way she had never seen it, and behind him, drawn by his voice down the long corridor, came the heavy, unhurried footsteps of his father. Edmund Ashcombe filled the doorway and stopped as though he'd struck glass. For a moment no one moved. Marin stood in the dead woman's dress, her hair loose, the boy between them with his hope already curdling toward confusion. The light from the west window fell across all three of them and held them like figures, in a painting no one had meant to make. Edmund's face went through its weathers fast. Shock first, the gray, slack shock she had seen in the mirror's reflection. Then a flush of something hot, recognizable, the beginning of fury. His jaw tightened. His hand closed on the doorframe. "Take it off," he said. His voice was very low. "Take it off this instant." Marin's hands were already at the buttons, fumbling, and her shame was so total it had a taste. "I have no excuse. None. I'll go. I'll pack my things and go tonight. You needn't. Be quiet." He stepped into the room. Sebastian flinched and pressed back against the wardrobe, and Edmund saw it, saw his son flinch from him, and something in his anger faltered at the edges. He looked at the boy. He looked at the woman. And he looked, finally, at the dress, and Marin watched the fury drain out of his face and leave behind something far worse, something she had no name for, a grief so fresh it might have been an hour old instead of a year. "It fits you," he said. It was not an accusation. It was barely a sentence. Adeline could never, the seamstress always had to. He stopped. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. Marin stood frozen, one button undone. "Sir, I'll have it off in a moment, I only—" "Why?" he said. The single word cracked. "Why are you wearing it?" And Marin, who had spent 6 weeks being unseen, who had spent 2 years being small, found that the lie would not come. She was too far past lying, so she told him the truth in a voice that shook. When I was a girl, she said, I had nothing. I used to stand outside a shop in the city, a bridal shop, with my face against the cold glass, and I would look at the dresses, and I would tell myself that someday I would wear one. Not to marry, just to feel like something that mattered, like something rare. Her eyes filled. I married in a borrowed frock the color of dishwater. My husband died 2 winters ago. I have been behind on everything ever since, money and sleep and hope. And I came in here to air the gowns, and I found this one, and it was the dress from the window. The exact dress from the window, sir, hanging in a room no one comes to. And I am so ashamed, but I wanted just once, before I die plain and poor and forgotten, to know what it felt like. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. That's all it was. A foolish woman in a borrowed dress. It will never happen again. The room was silent. Sebastian looked between them, his wooden horse clutched to his chest. Edmund had not moved. But the thing in his face had changed again. He was looking at her now, not at the dress at her, as though she had said something he had been waiting a year to hear and had given up, hoping for. Plain, he repeated softly. You think you're plain. I know what I am, sir. No, he said, I don't believe you do. He crossed the room then slowly, and Marin braced for him to seize the dress, to tear it from her, to call for Mrs. Penhallow and the end of everything. Instead, he stopped an arm's length away and looked down at his son. Sebastian, he said, and his voice had gone strange and gentle. Go and find Mrs. Penhallow. Tell her. Tell her Mrs. Holloway will be staying. Tell her there's been no harm done. The boy hesitated. Then, astonishingly, he crossed to Marin first and took her hand, her bare hand, cold with fright, and squeezed it once, hard the way a person holds a railing on a bridge. Then he ran. Edmund watched him go. When he turned back to Marin, his eyes were wet and his mouth was unsteady, and he looked less like a millionaire than like a man who had been lost in a house full of locked rooms and had just heard faintly somewhere the sound of one of them opening. He hasn't said mama in a year, Edmund said. He hasn't taken anyone's hand since the bridge. He told her to keep the dress on while she put the others away, which made no sense and all the sense in the world, and she understood that he simply could not yet watch her become a maid again. So she moved down the rows of muslin-seathed gowns in ivory silk, airing them, and he stood by the window with his hands behind his back and talked. Haltingly at first, then in a long unspooling, the way a wound bleeds when the pressure finally comes off. He told her about Adeline, how she had laughed too loud in quiet rooms, how she had hated this house and loved the gardens, how the wedding dress had been altered 4 times because she could never sit still for a fitting and the seamstress had despaired. How, after the accident on the icy bridge, he had locked the east wing and given orders that nothing be moved, and how the orders had spread, room by room, until the whole house was a museum of a life and he the only mourner permitted inside. I thought if nothing changed, he said, then nothing had truly ended. As long as her hairbrush stayed on the table, as long as the dress stayed in the dark. He laughed, low and without humor. I have spent a year keeping a tomb warm. Marin hung the last gown and turned. And the boy? Edmund's face crumpled and reformed. I forgot him, he admitted, barely audible. I'm ashamed to say it. I was so deep in my own grief that I forgot there was a smaller one walking the halls. He stopped speaking, and I told myself it was a phase. He stopped taking my hand, and I told myself he was tired. He pressed his eyes with finger and thumb, and then a stranger puts on a dress, and he says a word he hasn't said in a year, and he takes her hand, and I see, God help me, I see what I have done to my own son by burying us all alive. There was nothing Marin could say to that. So she did what she knew how to do. She crossed the room, knelt, and began folding the muslin covers into neat squares, ordinary work, the kind that lets a person stand to be near a grief without staring at it. You should let some light into this wing, she said quietly, not looking up. not to forget her, to keep her somewhere the moths can't reach. A locked room doesn't hold a person. It only holds the dark. Edmund was quiet a long moment. My wife would have liked you, he said. She had no patience for people who agreed with her. Something shifted in the house after that day, slow as a season. Marin went back to being a maid. She changed out of the dress, hung it carefully in its shroud, and Edmund did not ask her to wear it again, which was right. But the locked east wing was unlocked. The sheets came off the mirrors. Mrs. Penhallow, who missed nothing, watched Edmund come down to breakfast for the first time in a year, and very carefully said nothing at all, though Marin caught her dabbing her eyes over the porridge. Sebastian changed most of all. He began to follow Marin through her work, silent at first, then narrating in a small rusty voice. The names of his paper birds, the history of the wooden horse, with the chipped ear which had been carved by his grandfather. He asked Marin to teach him to fold the birds himself. She did at the kitchen table, the two of them creasing paper while the bread rose, and when his first one finally held its shape, he looked up at her with such fierce pride that her throat closed. Edmund found them like that one evening, flour on the table and paper birds in a flock between them, and he stood in the doorway the way he had stood in the wardrobe room. But this time the thing in his face was not grief. He pulled out a chair. "Teach me," he said. "I'm hopeless with my hands, but teach me anyway." So the three of them folded birds, and the millionaire's clumsy attempt looked like a crumpled hat. And Sebastian laughed. Actually laughed. Bright and unguarded. And Edmund looked at Marin across the table with an expression she had to look away from, because it was too much, too fast, and she was still a maid, and he was still a man in mourning, and the wedding ring on the string beneath her collar still belonged to someone she had loved. She told herself it was only kindness between them. She told herself the warmth in the house was the boy's, not hers to claim. She told herself a great many things that autumn, folding birds in a kitchen that had begun very quietly to feel like a home. On the first cold evening of November, Edmund asked her to stay for supper at the family table. Not to serve, to sit, Mrs. Penhallow brought a third place setting without being asked, and set it down with the gravity of a woman laying a cornerstone. Sebastian insisted Marin sit beside him. They ate, and they talked, and at one point Edmund said something dry and unexpected, and Marin laughed, before she could stop herself, and the sound rang through the great dining room that had heard no laughter in a year. Edmund went still. He was looking at her again. "That," he said softly, "is the first time this house has sounded like itself since she died." Marin looked down at her plate, her heart loud, and did not know what she felt, only that it was enormous. The trouble, when it came, wore a fine coat and a sympathetic smile. Cornelius Vane was Adeline's brother, Edmund's brother-in-law, a man of the city, smooth as a polished rail. He had managed certain of Edmund's railway investments during the worst of the grief, when Edmund could not bear to read a ledger, and he arrived that December under the banner of family concern. He stayed a week. He watched everything. He watched the maid sit at the family table. He watched his nephew take her hand and follow her through the halls. He watched Edmund laugh at something she said, and then catch himself almost guiltily. And Cornelius's sympathetic smile did not waver, but his eyes went cold and calculating behind it. He found Marin in the corridor on his third day. "Mrs. Holloway, isn't it?" He did not offer his hand. "The maid who has made herself so very indispensable." "I do my work, sir. I'm sure you do." He looked her over the way a man appraises timber. "I knew my sister well. I know her things. I know, for instance, that her wedding gown is no longer in its shroud where the staff swear it has hung untouched for a year." He let that settle. "It's been worn, Mrs. Holloway, recently. The fold lines tell the story. I wonder what my grieving brother-in-law would make of a servant trying on his dead wife's wedding dress. I wonder what the town would make of it." The floor seemed to tilt. "It isn't it's exactly what I think it is," Cornelius said pleasantly. "And it will be exactly what everyone thinks it is, because that is how these things work." A poor widow worms her way into a rich widower's house. She puts on his late wife's dress. She bewitches the child, softens the father, positions herself for a marriage that would make her mistress of a fortune that ought by every natural right to pass to blood. He smiled. You see how it tells itself. Marin's mouth was dry. I want nothing of his fortune. They never do, Cornelius said. Here is what will happen. You will give your notice. You'll cite a sick relative, a change of circumstance, whatever spares your dignity. You'll be gone by the new year. And in exchange, I will not tell my brother-in-law, or the town, or the magistrate who oversees the boy's guardianship, that the woman he's grown so fond of is a fortune-seeker who defiled his wife's memory. He adjusted his cuff. I'm being generous. I'm letting you leave with your name. And if I refuse? Then I take the matter to Edmund myself, framed in my own words, and I assure you my words are very good. He's fragile, Mrs. Holloway. A man like that, a year into grief, primed to feel he's betrayed his late wife by feeling anything at all for the help. How hard do you imagine it will be to make him believe the worst? To make him hate you? To make him feel that every soft thing he's felt since autumn was a trap you laid? He tilted his head. Not hard at all. The seed is already in him. I'd just be watering it. He left her in the corridor with her heart in pieces. What made it unbearable was that he was right about the shape of it, even where he was wrong about the substance. Marin had worn the dress. The fold lines did tell a story, a true one, just not his. And Edmund was fragile. She had watched him war with himself all autumn, drawn toward her and recoiling, glad and guilty in the same breath. A man could be made to believe almost anything about a thing he already half feared was true. She thought of Sebastian. If she left, the boy would lose the second person to vanish from his life without explanation. He would learn all over again that the people who hold your hand let go. She could not do that to him. But if she stayed, and Cornelius poisoned the well, Edmund might come to look at her with the same shock she'd seen in the mirror that first day. Only this time the dead would not have risen. They would have been disturbed by a thief. She did not give notice. But she pulled back, and pulling back was its own slow damage. She stopped sitting at the family table. She invented reasons: kitchen work, a headache, the wash. She stopped lingering in the evenings. When Edmund found her in a corridor and began, haltingly, to say something that had warmth beneath it, she answered briskly and excused herself, and watched the confusion and then the hurt move across his face, and made herself walk away. She told herself it was protection. She told herself a clean withdrawal now was kinder than a ruin later. Sebastian felt it first, the way children feel weather. He grew quiet again. The paper birds stopped appearing on the kitchen step. One afternoon, Marin found him sitting on the nursery floor with the wooden horse, not playing, just holding it, and when she knelt beside him, he would not look at her. You're going to go, he said, not a question. Everyone goes. Sebastian, Mama went on the bridge and didn't come back. And now you've gone funny and quiet like before, and that's how it starts. His chin trembled. I'm not going to fold birds anymore. There's no point. They just fly off. It broke her heart clean in two, but she could not explain to an 8-year-old that his uncle was holding her name over a flame. So she said nothing useful, and the boy turned back to his horse, and Marin went down to the kitchen and gripped the edge of the table until the spell of weeping passed. Cornelius, meanwhile, did not wait idly for her to break. He worked on Edmund directly, with the patience of a man laying track. Marin caught fragments, Cornelius's lowered voice in the study, the words appearances and the boy's inheritance. And you must be careful, Edmund. Grief makes a man a fool, and there are women who know how to read a grieving man like a timetable. She heard Edmund's voice, uncertain, defensive, then quiet. She saw Edmund begin to watch her differently, not coldly, not yet, but with a new wariness, a man asked to doubt the one warm thing in his house, and not yet sure whether to. The worst of it was a single evening near Christmas. Edmund came to the kitchen, which he never did, and stood in the doorway and asked her, carefully, watching her face, whether it was true that she had worn Adeline's wedding dress. Marin's whole body went cold. Here it was. She could lie. She could say Cornelius was mistaken, that the fold lines meant nothing, that she'd only aired the gowns. The lie was right there, and it would protect her, and it would make her exactly the secret-keeping creature Cornelius had described. She looked at Edmund, at the man who had unlocked the east wing, who had folded a bird that looked like a crumpled hat, who had said her laugh was the first time the house had sounded like itself. And she found she would rather lose him with the truth than keep him with a lie. Yes, she said, I wore it, the day you found me. That was the first time and the only time. I told you why, and every word I told you was true. I've never lied to you, sir, and I won't begin now, even to save myself. Edmund stared at her. Something complicated crossed his face, but before he could answer, Cornelius's voice came smoothly from behind him in the corridor. There, you see. Edmund, she admits it. And Marin understood that the conversation had been arranged, that Edmund had been sent to test her, that Cornelius had been listening all along. Edmund turned to his brother-in-law. He turned back to Marin. He was a man standing between two stories about the same fact, and his face showed how tired he was, how frightened of being a fool, how desperate not to betray the dead by trusting the living. I think, Edmund said heavily, it would be best, Mrs. Holloway, if you took some days away. Until I can, until this is clearer, Mrs. Penhallow will see you have your wages. And Cornelius, behind him, allowed himself the smallest smile. Marin untied her apron with steady hands, because she would not break in front of the man who had engineered this, and she went up to pack her single bag. She left at dawn, on foot, in the gray frock the color of dishwater, with her dead husband's ring on its string beneath her collar and her whole small life in one bag. No one saw her off. Edmund kept to his study. Mrs. Penhallow pressed an envelope of wages into her hands and held them a moment too long, her eyes wet, but said only, "This isn't finished, mark me." Marin did not believe her. At the gate, she looked back once at the great house on the hill, lit and dusted for no one again, the east wing already, she imagined, sliding back toward dark. She had unlocked one room and been thrown out for it. The dream she'd worn for a single breath had cost her everything that breath had been worth. She took a room above the same tailor's shop she'd fled 2 years before, which felt like proof that a life could run in circles and call it living. She found piecework, mending, the cold needle and thread economy of poor women everywhere. She did not weep mostly. She was too tired to weep. She had learned long ago that grief, like debt, simply has to be carried until you're strong enough to set it down, and she was not strong enough yet. What undid her was not Edmund. It was the boy. She kept seeing Sebastian on the nursery floor with his wooden horse. Everyone goes, they just fly off. She had become the very thing she'd sworn not to be, another person who held his hand and let go. She had let Cornelius's threat make her small and silent, exactly as fear had always made her small and silent, and in protecting herself she had abandoned a child who had said mama to her, once in a doorway full of light. Her husband's voice came back to her, the thing he used to say. Character is what you do when the room is empty. The room was empty now. It had been empty her whole life, and she had spent that emptiness hiding, from longing, from love, from the risk of being seen and found wanting. She sat by the cold window with frost creeping up the glass, the way it had crept up the bridal shop window 20 years before, and she understood, at last, what the silence had been trying to teach her. She would not hide anymore. The thing that had ruined her was a secret, a dress worn in the dark, a truth held back out of fear. And the answer to a secret is not a better secret. It is light. Cornelius had built his whole trap out of shadows and fold lines and what a thing looks like. The only way to break it was to drag the entire matter into the open, in front of everyone, where his polished half-truths could not survive being said plainly beside the real one. She would go back, not to plead, to testify, and she knew exactly who would believe her. She did not go to Edmund first. She went to Mrs. Penhallow. The housekeeper met her at the kitchen door 3 days after Christmas, took one look at her face and put the kettle on without a word. Marin laid it all out. Cornelius's threat in the corridor, the bargain he'd offered, the arranged conversation he'd staged. Mrs. Penhallow listened with her arms folded and her mouth going thinner and thinner. "I knew it," she said when Marin finished. "I knew that man was laying track. He's been after the boy's inheritance since the funeral. If Sebastian's raised by a doting father and a new wife, the fortune passes clean to the child and stays there. But if the father can be kept broken and alone, and the boy made a sad, strange thing with no one steady in his life, why, then it's only sensible for a capable uncle to be given management of the estate, guardianship of the purse." She set down her cup hard. "He doesn't want you gone because you wore a dress. He wants you gone because you were fixing what he needs kept broken." Marin had not seen the whole shape of it until that moment. The dress was never the point. It was only the lever. "I need to say all of it," Marin said, to Edmund, "with Cornelius in the room, so he can't whisper a different version after I've gone. But Edmund won't believe me alone. It's my word against his brother-in-law's." "It isn't only your word," Mrs. Penhallow said. "I was in the larder the day he cornered you in the corridor. The door was open. I heard every syllable of his generous little offer." She smiled grimly. "I've kept house 30 years, Mrs. Holloway. I have learned to be exactly where I'm not noticed. And there's more. He's been writing to the magistrate already, letters about Edmund's instability, building his case. Cook posts the mail. She remembers every address." Marin stared at her. "Then we have him. Then we might have him," Mrs. Penhallow corrected, "if you've the nerve to stand in that drawing room and say it to their faces. He'll be smooth. He'll be wounded. He'll make you out a liar and a schemer in that reasonable voice of his." "Can you stand it?" Marin thought of the boy on the nursery floor. "Yes," she said. They chose New Year's Day, when Cornelius had announced he would bring the magistrate himself to the house to formalize, he'd said, certain arrangements for Sebastian's welfare. He thought he was arriving for his coronation. Mrs. Penhallow saw to it that Marin was waiting in the drawing room when they came, and that Cook and 2 of the staff were near, and that Sebastian was kept upstairs, but the door at the top of the stairs left open. Cornelius's smooth face flickered when he saw her, just once, just a hair's breadth, before the sympathy slid back over it. "Edmund, I'd hoped to spare you this. The woman's come back to make a scene. I warned you she would." "I've come to tell the truth," Marin said, "in front of all of you, where it can't be edited afterward. That's all. You may judge it however you like." And she told it, plainly, start to finish, leaving out nothing, not even the part that shamed her. She told them about the girl at the bridal shop window with frost on her cheeks. She told them about finding the dress and arguing with herself and losing the argument. She told them she had worn it once, for one breath, and been caught, and told Edmund the truth that very hour. Then she told them about the corridor, Cornelius's bargain, his threat, the staged conversation at the kitchen door with him listening behind. "He told me to leave with my name, or he'd destroy it," she said. "He told me a grieving man could be made to believe anything, and he was nearly right. But I'd rather you knew exactly who I am, a foolish woman who wore a dress she shouldn't have and never told a single lie about it, than have you keep believing whatever he's whispered in that study." Cornelius laughed gently, sorrowfully. "You see, Edmund, the imagination on her. A fortune-seeker's last gambit. There's not a shred of—" "I heard you," said Mrs. Penhallow. The room went very quiet. "In the corridor, the 11th of December, the larder door opened behind you. I heard every word of your generous offer to Mrs. Holloway." She turned to the magistrate, a stout, watchful man who had said nothing yet. "And Cook here can tell you the addresses on the letters this gentleman's been posting these 3 weeks. To your own office, sir, I believe, about Mr. Ashcomb's fitness." The magistrate's eyebrows rose toward the city man. "I have indeed received some correspondence," he said slowly. "Anonymous, it claimed to be. Concerned. Curious that you'd know its contents, madam, unless—" He looked at Cornelius with new and unfriendly attention. It came apart for Cornelius the way these things do. Not in a thunderclap, but in a slow leak no smile could plug. He protested. He grew less smooth. He made the mistake every cornered schemer makes, which is to keep talking, and every sentence dug the hole deeper, until the magistrate held up a hand and said he thought he'd seen enough to know which way the wind sat, and that he'd be reviewing the guardianship question with very different eyes than the ones Mr. Vane had hoped to supply. But Marin was not watching Cornelius anymore. She was watching Edmund, who had crossed the room while his brother-in-law floundered, and who now stood in front of her with that same look she'd had to glance away from in the kitchen all autumn. Only there was no guilt in it now, no war, nothing held back. "I let him send you away," Edmund said low, just to her. "I doubted you. A year of grief made me a coward, and I nearly let it cost me the best thing that walked into this house since the bridge." His voice broke. "Can you forgive a fool?" "There's nothing to forgive," she said. "You were afraid. I know what fear makes a person do. I lived inside it too long myself." Behind them, on the stairs, there were quick, small footsteps. Sebastian flew across the drawing room and seized Marin around the waist and held on as though she were a railing on a bridge, and would not let go, and this time neither did she. They married in the spring, in the unlocked east wing, with the windows thrown open and light pooling on the floor like spilled milk. Marin did not wear the ivory dress with the 100 buttons. That one she had carefully boxed in cedar and given to Sebastian to keep, because it was his mother's, and his mother deserved to be remembered somewhere the moths could not reach. She wore a new dress, a simple one, the rare thing she had finally decided she was allowed to be. She turned once before the tall mirror, undraped now, no sheet upon it. The woman who looked back was a maid no longer, a widow no longer, unseen no longer. The door opened behind her. It was the boy, come to take her hand.